I'll be blunt, I liked Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Despite their technical issues and intriguing design philosophy, I overall had an enjoyable time with the game, as did many of my friends. This video was originally meant to be just about my thoughts on the game, the things that I liked as well as the many that I disliked, but I felt that I couldn't fully give my thoughts on the matter without addressing the Kappa-Raja in the room being the logistical nightmare of the modern Pokemon franchise. And much like the Pokemon Company, I've decided to break up the video in two. I initially intended on talking both about Scarlet and Violet and the state of the Pokemon franchise in this one video because I think that both conversations benefit each other, but my thoughts ran a bit long on these specific games, so stay tuned for my in-depth look into the logistical nightmare of the Pokemon franchise. That video will be talking about the technical issues and problems that the franchise has been facing in recent years. I'll briefly mention Scarlet and Violet's technical issues at the very end of this video as a sort of teaser for the next one, but for now, let's talk about what I think these games did well, and also what I think they did very poorly. Pokemon games have a certain charm to them. Each one has a unique familiarity to them, and even with the last two main entries in the series being a fairly large departure from the Pokemon norm, they still feel like Pokemon. Scarlet and Violet have indeed kept the Pokemon feel, while still being the first traditional Pokemon game with a different gameplay loop. Legends definitely had a unique gameplay loop, and while still being a main series game, it's far from a traditional Pokemon game. Scarlet and Violet build upon the groundwork laid by Sword and Shield as well as Legends to create a fully open world, a first for the series. When the game was first announced, I went from excited to skeptical as to how an open world would actually work with Pokemon. As long as open world games have been mainstream, fans have wanted an open world Pokemon, and yet I wasn't sure if that was the right move for Pokemon. After playing Scarlet and Violet, I can say with confidence that this was a good move, but it still has a lot of work to be done as well. Exploration is honestly a ton of fun in the Paldea region, and during my first playthrough, I was always eager to see what lay ahead. I wanted to see what shape the world would have as well as what creatures I might find. This can of course be said for all of the games prior, but exploration is at the forefront of Scarlet and Violet. It's the key to the gameplay loop, and it's what makes the open world format work for Pokemon. The world is pretty varying, and for the most part I would say that it's cleverly designed. For the most part. Earlier, I alluded to a certain charm that Pokemon games have, which I dubbed Pokemon Charm in my video on Pokemon Legends Arceus. And save for a few spots in the world, I think that Paldea is lacking in the Pokemon Charm. For starters, the world of Paldea is fairly bland. It works quite well as an open world, but as a Pokemon world, I think it misses the mark, with towns being the most egregious. The aesthetic of each town is pretty darn good, but that's about as far as they go. People often point to Sword and Shield as having a terribly designed region, and while I won't argue my thoughts on that, I will say that the majority of the towns in the Galar region are far more memorable than any of the ones found in Paldea. The structure of the towns in Sword and Shield are no different than they were in Red and Blue. A bunch of buildings, some you could go into and others you couldn't. And while Scarlet and Violet do still follow that structure, it isn't done to the same extent. Shops are practically all the same, even having duplicates of the same shop in a given town, and for the most part, buildings are almost entirely closed off, a full-on downgrade to what we've had in prior games ever since the beginning. In my opinion, they just don't stand out. And as for the world itself, I feel that it is lacking key landmarks that define the region. None of the caves, grasslands, or drylands really have anything that stands out, and while Legends also fails in this department, it has the caveat of being the Sinnoh region as a whole to make reference to. Paldea doesn't have any nostalgia or any gimmicks that really help its design. This all became more apparent to me on my second playthrough. I'd already spent 100 or so hours exploring the region in my first playthrough, and so I'd more or less seen it all. And when I went to play it again, I was put off from wanting to explore, more in favor of just playing the whole thing in as a sort of boss rush mode. Even still, things that stood out were pretty great. Specific characters like the gym leaders Iono and Larry are so good. I especially loved Iono's gym, which was a surprisingly accurate commentary on social media influencers and streamers. The fact that someone donates 5,000 Pokédollars to her during your match was funny enough, and then I realized that she doesn't even give you that amount when you beat her. Her gym puzzle was also one of the best, which I concede isn't that hard when you compare it to the rest. And by all means, gym puzzles were never really anything to write home about in the prior games, but I just felt that most of them in this game were pretty lackluster. It's not bad. It's bad,
I hated
but
it,
it's
dude.
not bad. Oh, it's pretty bad. Why couldn't this have been cool? It was so close to being cool. This doesn't take away, however, from the overall gameplay loop. Honestly, the gameplay loop of Scarlet and Violet isn't half bad. It's not as good as Legends Arceus, but still probably one of the best loops we've had in a traditional mainline game for some time. So much so that some of my friends who hadn't played a Pokemon game for years were hooked on the game from the start. Even when I asked them about their game performance issues, they responded that, hey, it's not as bad as this game or that game. And yes, while Scarlet and Violet may perform better than some games, I won't give it a passing grade on that front. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, I just want to talk about the gameplay loop. I have my personal issues with the gameplay loop and issues with the game mechanics, but let's start with what went right. What was it that kept my friends playing a Pokemon game for longer than 20 hours that prior games didn't have? If I had to pinpoint it, I'd probably say it was how interactive the game is. Between co-op play and the expansive open world, there is so much that can suck players in. Co-op play is better than it's ever been. You can play through the game in its entirety alongside your friends without interfering with each other's story. When it works. Of course, there's that exception. But regardless, when it did work, it was a lot of fun to get lost in the Paldea region with your friends, each doing their own thing. And speaking of the Paldea region, I touched a bit on it prior, but it really is a great region for exploration. I think that this is due in part because of the Pokemon in the world as well. As you explore, you find Pokemon everywhere you go. You can watch them and they will watch you, especially when you get into a battle. Look at this side. He just watched. What are these things over here? They're watching
so
too.
Pokemon. It's like, I'm next.
I'm next. The Pokemon are more expressive in Scarlet and Violet than they have ever been. They interact with each other and the world around them. It's a huge step in the right direction and immerses the player into the world of Pokemon. It really feels like you are your own person in the vast Pokemon world, on your own path doing whatever you want. That's highlighted with the game letting you take on challenges in any order you feel. Okay, sorta. There are level barriers that are present in the same way they are present in many other open world RPGs, and that's fine. My biggest issue with them is that even though you can do whatever you want to in any order you want, it feels like the developers want you to go in a specific route from badge to badge. I went back and forth on this for a while, but I've come to the conclusion that I think it would have been better overall for the game if there was a simple level scaling like how your rival Nemona scales to how many badges you have when you fight her. I know there are pros to not having scaling, but I think the cons here outweigh them. Piggybacking on what I just said, that feeling of freedom is sort of stripped when you realize that you are too weak to take on a powerful gym, and when you stumble on a weak gym at the end of your journey, it feels just as bad. Like how I mentioned prior, this game suffers from a repeat playthrough. Not only do you know the world, but you also know the correct order of the badges. Alternatively, if there was a scaling, the replayability would have been boosted immensely due to being able to truly take on any challenge you want in any order you want. Also, single-use TMs are bad. I won't budge on that. Before we really get to all the negativity that will undoubtedly be the latter half of the video, let's talk about the story of Scarlet and Violet. I will for sure be talking about it unfiltered, spoilers galore, so if you don't want to be spoiled, jump to the next section. Pokemon has never been known to tell a great story. They do it sometimes, but they are few and far between, and usually they end with the 10-year-old saving the world. This time around, Scarlet and Violet seeks to tell a couple of simple and grounded stories. Sun and Moon's was similar and very good at times, but in the end, they left it up to a 10-year-old to save the world. And you could argue that Scarlet and Violet kinda do the same thing, but it really didn't feel that way to me. Or at least the threat never felt all that threatening. Penny's story was about bullying and how the authority figures in life sometimes don't notice or pretend not to notice the harmful actions people take against others. This is great, honestly not for me, but to those who have dealt with this, I know it got to them. I've heard people talk about why it was impactful to them, and as an outsider looking in, I can see why it is good. Arvin's story of parental abandonment and dealing with the almost loss of the only thing in the world that he is close to is especially powerful, but yet again, I can't fully sympathize. This story though was much easier for me to understand, and I felt for Arvin's character. The whole section in Area Zero surrounding its conclusion was phenomenal as well. Don't even get me started on that finale either. The descent through Area Zero is just stunning. The visuals and music coming together to show you something completely alien to what you've seen the whole game, or the entire series for that matter, is incredible. Learning that Arven's parent was dead all along was something I never expected Pokemon to do, and the fight with the AI version of his parent was great. It wasn't a hard fight by any means, but the scripted portion at the end where you have to select Koraidon or Miraidon and then use its moves to follow the script is probably the best moment in the entire Pokemon series. Seeing you and your friends' Pokeballs not work, and coming to the realization that Miraidon or Koraidon was in the Professor's Pokeball, so it would be unlocked, is so cool. Being able to use Endure at the turn after the taunt wears off is cheesy, but great. I loved it all. But controversially, the story that I liked and honestly related to the most was Nemona's. I'll admit at the start, I didn't really care for her character. In fact, it wasn't until the descent into Area Zero, where you're walking down with Arven, Penny, and Nemona, that I actually cared about her story. Her mentioning that her parents were hands-off raising her, and that her big sister would most likely take over the family business struck me deep. Never had I related more to a fictional character than I did at that moment. It literally felt like someone saw my upbringing and took the thoughts out of my head and put them onto a script. I've been there, in that exact same situation before. I've been in the middle of a group of people who all talked about how their lives were rough and their parents weren't great, and I always felt incredibly awkward because my parents are amazing, and like Nemona, they wanted me to be my own person and find what I wanted to do with my life. And while my brother didn't end up taking over the family farm, I went my whole young life assuming that he would. Her character arc goes farther than just that. She's not just the yandere battle-obsessed person that everyone makes her out to be. I mean, she is, but there was way more thought put into her character than just that. Her post-game side story goes into a bit more, and I'll just say, we all fight our own battles, and Nemona is just like me for real. It's pretty obvious that Pokemon Scarlet and Violet runs worse than Genshin Impact on an Android phone from 2015. There are times that it runs fine, but most of the time it runs at a laughable 5 to 25 FPS. Historically, Pokemon games have rarely run well on the device that they are on. Diamond and Pearl had terrible slowdown, as did just about every main series game following, especially during double battles. And I hate to be that guy because just about everyone has said it, but it's baffling that games like Xenoblade Chronicles 3 can run and look as good as it does on the same hardware as Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Not to say that Xenoblade looks stunning, but for being on the low-powered Switch, it does a pretty damn good job. So if games can look and play as good as these do on the Switch, then Pokemon should be just fine, theoretically. I'm not sure why, but I have my theories, which I will be withholding till the next video. Game Freak is constantly updating the game, with one update already that, in my opinion, has helped its performance. Some say it hasn't for them, but I have seen a noticeable difference. Yet, making something laggy slightly less laggy really isn't a fixed game though now, is it? And that's just performance too. I also think the game looks hideous. Area Zero looks fine, and it works, but mostly as a shock factor. The whole rest of the game looks pretty bad in my opinion, save for a few areas. I think the Pokemon models look better than they ever have before, but the world is just ugly. Pokemon's art style peaked with the Let's Go games, don't at me. Just like Legends, I hate the climbing in this game. I thought it was better at first, but then the honeymoon period lifted. It's bad and it's buggy too.
Oh, I don't see a gimme goal.
You don't see? Look at my screen, there's a gimme ghoul in front. It's
the hell?
asleep in front of us. I don't know what it's doing there.
In the
I
treasure
have
box?
2 of these.
Yeah, it's just chilling in the treasure box. Well, I think I figured it out. There was a gimme ghoul in front of me, and I caught it like earlier, like in the actual game. So maybe that's what that is. Like, no, that's exactly what it is because it's asleep. That's the gimme ghoul I just got done catching.
And it just...
It's still there. It's just still chilling.
Your Pokeball went above it. You
No, it
threw
didn't really.
above
I
it.
missed
Yeah,
that.
it went above it.
Oh, the record button
That's
closed.
so weird, dude. Yes, this game definitely has its issues. Issues that feel like they came from the game being rushed and unfinished. I hate using that term, but I really don't know what else to call it. The stuff that is done well is done very well, and the things that weren't, really weren't. But that's where we're going to leave it for today. I didn't realize I had as much to say about Scarlet and Violet as I did. Honestly, there's more I could have said, but I think what I did covers my overall thoughts. I really did enjoy these games. They're some of the most fun I've had in Pokemon for a long time. Being able to play alongside a group of friends made that experience all the better. It's no secret that I love this franchise. but I do try my best to stay unbiased whenever I look at these games objectively. And look, I have enjoyed every Pokemon game as they have come out. I know that they aren't the best games ever made, far from it. Yet I just can't not buy them and play them. This is the first time that I've truly felt misled on what we were getting, yet I think there was more to the story than just Game Freak being lazy, or that they need more time to work on games, and so on. I mean, I already covered Game Freak's other games before. I know that they aren't lazy, and I know that they can make some insanely fun gameplay loops. But there is something wrong with the current Pokemon franchise, so next time, we'll be talking about the logistical nightmare of the Pokemon franchise. Stay tuned.